this next section will focus on the later Middle Ages, the 15th century, and this will give you the historical background for the later Middle Ages that you will need to know to learn more about Thomas Malory. So in the 15th century, that's the 1400s, Chaucer dies in 1400, and so in the 15th century, that becomes a really vital time for literary culture. William Caxton made a great body of text available to aristocratic and middle class readers in English, with his printing of several texts, including Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as well as later he prints Malory's Mort d'Arthur. Malory writes Mort d'Arthur, creating a trimmed version with French story origins, but a decidedly English connection to politics and life. More commoners during this time have access to education and finances than ever before in our study. Most books at this time were private. However, many more public and oral literary cultures continued to thrive during the 15th century. So, one thing we need to know in order to learn about Malory and Mort d'Arthur is filling in some of these blanks about women and courtliness and courtly love during the time period. So, women in the Middle Ages began to have access to books, and with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, they were able to get some sort of self-awareness by seeing themselves in the pages of the books. Women's literacy and cultural roles were often complex and contradictory during this time. You know, in most of the tales, especially in Malory's tale, they're really seen as just flat, one-dimensional characters who are used by the round male characters and aren't seen as very complex. Chaucer is the exception. And then in life, that is the case in terms of their cultural roles, but there also seems to be some huge contradictions. For instance, Matilda raising an army to save her son's life and leading that army, and him ultimately becoming king. Women had various limitations of power, and we can discuss that as a group, but often they were the focus of medieval courtly romances and courtly tradition. Here's a picture of a knight and a lady participating in courtly love. So, Wikipedia defines courtly love as a medieval European literary conception of love that emphasized nobility and chivalry. Medieval literature is filled with examples of knights setting out on adventures and performing various service for ladies because of their courtly love. Okay, sorry about my dog barking. I'm really sorry about that. Anyway, so one thing that you'll want to keep in mind about this, and what I'm going to hopefully make clear to you, is that this idea of courtly love that Wikipedia gives us in this little stub isn't necessarily the most correct, okay? Yes, this is part of it, that it was a medieval conception of love that emphasized nobility and structure, but it really puts a lot of emphasis on ladies, which was part of it, but that really wasn't that much of it when it came down to it. So let's talk about this. So, you've heard it before, chivalry, the manners of how a gentleman should treat a fair lady. When you use the word chivalry, chances are you are thinking of this idea of a man opening the door, taking off his coat. And people will say, is chivalry dead? And I will argue, was it ever really alive? And scholars argue about this. They argue about why was it practiced? Was it ever wildly practiced? Or was this just the stuff of fiction? Was this worship of women empowering or oppressive? And the answer is kind of complex because chivalry actually doesn't mean what we think modernly of as good manners. That's not exactly what it meant during this time period. So hopefully this lecture will teach you a little bit about what it actually means. So what is chivalry really? Let's take a look at this quick video.
Think of chivalry, and you might imagine knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. Chivalry originated in ideals associated with a knight's code of conduct. Over time, it came to more broadly represent a model for the behavior and moral principles of the upper classes.
We can think of chivalry as a code of honor that really came to fruition in the 11th and 12th centuries. And many of the values that chivalry championed are things that we still value today. Loyalty, bravery, protection of the weak.
Chivalry wasn't just about gallant acts meant to impress a princess. It widely affected culture, from love relationships to hunting, fashion to law. This illustrated E is contained within a medieval law book. You see two knights on horses facing one another. They are about to settle a disagreement over a debt. Hunting was a chance to improve oneself physically and mentally, not unlike the goals of chivalry.
It's typical in these stories that there is an aristocrat or a knight who is in love with a woman of a higher social standing that's already married. It was thought that the man's love for this higher standing woman would have had a civilizing effect on him. The code of honor provided a means for aristocrats to kind of move up the social ladder. If they knew these rules, if they knew how to behave in a tournament or how to dress for a banquet, then that was a way of displaying one's social standing. But it's the nature of having rules like this that certain people are left out of that club. Because we have such romantic notions of what chivalry is, we don't tend to think of the practical consequences of chivalry during this period.
No, you did not mishear the examples of the tales that pertain to chivalry and the treatment of women. Chivalry was about tips for how to impress an already married woman. That's what it was about. So, of course, I'm being a little glib here, and there were some really serious codes of chivalry. It's just sometimes our modern lens looks on the good things and doesn't think about some of the other things that maybe weren't so great about chivalry. Basically, what you could think of it as is a king's guide to keeping your rowdy knights in check, complete with legends and lore. Rules helped to police the knights, when the idea of the police like we think of it didn't really exist. Having this code of ethics helped keep people following the right path and able to move up if they wanted to. The Arthurian legends, French and British, reinforced the ideals and codes of conduct of the time. You might think of this and relate this to modern military guidebooks that cover everything from how a soldier should dress, how their uniform should be kept, to how their gun should be cleaned. And this is, just a modern example, and I show it really so much is because I think it's kind of funny to see a video from the Vietnam era. It's a Navy training video called How to Succeed with Brunettes. I won't show the whole thing, but we'll just listen to a piece of it, and I'll put the link up if you want to watch it on your own. Let me move it about a few minutes in. Hold on.
Now, good impression. Take your...
Sorry guys, let me just move it right here.
Isn't going to work.
Here you go.
How about starting by being on time? Not just for a date, but for any social engagement or business appointment. This indicates you are a dependable, businesslike person, that the appointment means something to you. And let's face it, a good-looking girl isn't going to wait around too long for anybody. Too many young men on the prowl. Make it easy for her to slip into her coat. Hold it at the right height. That's being thoughtful. Watch the hair. If you muss it, you're going to lose points. No, you don't grab her arm. You offer assistance. If she needs it or wants it, she'll take your hand, or perhaps your arm. But once the need for assistance is past, she'll give it back to you. So don't be surprised. Yes, doors do offer an excellent chance to make a good impression. It's a way to show your respect for ladies, or your seniors for that matter. Thoughtfulness, making things easier for someone else. This is at the heart of good manners.
So, you can see, I just use that as an example to show you that, you know, these ideas about chivalry and good manners were military codes, not unsimilar to some of the military codes that are in our recent, you know, past or even our current ideas. So this brings me to the discussion of romance. So courtliness was expressed in lyric poetry, like Chaucer, and in a wide range of vernacular narratives. Remember, vernacular is just the fancy way of saying everyday language that we now call loosely romances. I'm not talking about things that like have Fabio on the cover. Romances instead were usually warning tales of transgressive love to the hero in society. Like if you love the wrong person, it's going to be your downfall. They also weren't all about love. Often there were stories of encounters with the supernatural or things that were marvelous and taboo. And it was about learning and about making the right choices. Romances can also swing very wildly from the mundane to the extraordinary. Thomas Malory does this often. 1 second you're riding on a horse and suddenly a magical fairy is gifting you an awesome sword. So when you're thinking of romances, don't think Fabio, think King Arthur, okay? I just want to note that I talk a lot about the French influence and the Norman influence on the Arthurian legend, but in case there is any confusion, some of these tales and legends do come from the early Celtic and Welsh stories, as well as the French stories that were settled after the Battle of Hastings from William the Conqueror. So just wanted to clarify that. So that brings us back to our timeline. And this brings us to our study of Malory. And I've misspelled Malory here. It should be 1L. Hopefully I didn't do that in other places. And just to show you, you know, Chaucer dies here in 1400. And then this is where we start the 15th century. And this is what we refer to as the later Middle Ages. And this is where you're going to see Thomas Malory writing and completing Mort d'Arthur in around 1460, so right in the middle of the century. And there are several other things that are being published by William Caxton in the 1400s. He's publishing Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He's also publishing Mort d'Arthur after Malory completes it. And now we're seeing a rise in literacy rates. Roughly 30% of the population can read, which is huge as compared to earlier studies of the Middle Ages. And so this also is when, around the end of the 15th century, is when the War of the Roses is taking place. And we won't really cover the War of the Roses in this lecture about Thomas Malory, even though I will make mention of it because it does influence his personal life. We'll talk more about the War of the Roses a little bit later in the next section of study of British literature. So here we go. culture in the 15th century. We already talked about that. I must have gotten a little out of order. Here we go. So, if you want, first a tip about Malory. If you want to know more about his personal life, listen to the podcast that I have included in the content called In Our Time for more background on his personal life, because there is a lot of debates surrounding Malory. We think we know who he was, but we're not quite sure, and so there's sometimes other people that will say, no, this is Malory and this was his life. But for the sake of not driving ourselves insane, we're going to go with the idea of Malory is Sir Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel. So Malory wrote, from what we understand, Malory wrote Mort to Arthur while on house arrest. A little ironic, considering that the Arthurian legend is all about, being the good guy, but whatever. Possibly Malory was either a good guy or a bad guy, and that's where some of the debate comes from, because it could be that he was caught up in some of the divisions between the monarchy and the aristocracy that came from the War of the Roses. We don't know if that's the case, but we do know that he was arrested for theft and rape, among other things. I do want to caution you, though, when we talk about him being arrested for rape, I don't want to minimize that, but at this time period, if a man and a woman had an affair, because the woman would be a husband's property, even if the woman consented to the sexual encounter, it would still be considered rape, because that he would be raping the other man's property. Now, I don't know all of the surroundings of Malory's life, and he could have very well raped someone, which would be terrible. But I do just want to tell you that, because we're not really sure whether he did that or not. And so I wouldn't want you to take away from the class, oh, Thomas Malory was a rapist. Maybe, maybe not, okay? And that's a strong word in today's context to throw around lightly. So, Le Mort d'Arthur, sometimes it's got an apostrophe, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on who edits the text. So, if you put either one, I'm not going to count you off on that. We're not going to be looking from excerpts from the textbook. Instead, we're going to look at links to specific stories online. And we're going to focus on Arthur, the Sword and the Stone, and Arthur's relationship with Merlin. So as you read the links, here are some tips for reading Malory. First and foremost, read it aloud. Even if you feel like a big dork, go hide in your closet with a flashlight so no one will hear you read it aloud. This will help you get the nuances of the words, okay? Focus on the plot first. Read a few sentences, then in the margins, write down what happened. Then read more. This will help you get organized, because as we'll find out a little bit later, Malory has a tendency to leave things kind of in a lurch on occasion because of his rhyme scheme. So that will help you keep organized. 3, don't get too bogged down by all the different knights and ladies' names. Focus on the main characters. Focus on Arthur. Focus on Merlin. Focus on King Uther. Those are the people that are going to be the most important, okay? After you have the plot down, do go back and reread to understand the nuances. I have picked some excerpts that are not too incredibly long so that you will have time to go back and reread and really spend some time with this text to get the most understanding that you can from it. So I do want to mention a little bit about the style of the text, because I think that might help you as you're trying to read to understand the plot and then understand nuance. So Malory uses a variety of French sources to create his prose on Arthur. Luckily, he trimmed most of the stories to condensed versions. You might not feel like he did condense it when you look at it, but I promise you he really did condense it. If I made you read some of the French versions, you'd be like, I want to stab my eye out. Notice the rhyme of the prose. This can be a little confusing because Malory sometimes leaves out the details for the sake of rhyme. It can take some filling in between the lines to figure things out. So if you're like, I've read this and I'm still missing something, that would be a good opportunity to ask on the discussion board or ask me in an email. Specifically, don't say, I read that and I don't get it. I'm not going to be able to help you there. But saying, I read this, but I didn't understand in these lines what happened specifically. Okay? That because sometimes there might be some things that you just don't get. But if you understand the context, you should be able to get it. Notice how this text style is also designed to be recited. The style is perfect for the English scop tradition that we've talked about before. Remember, scop is the English way of saying storyteller. And that's important because literacy rates were increasing, but many still could not read. So this would have been helpful for Malory's audience to have it in that scop style. So some things to consider when you're analyzing Malory. First and foremost, consider the audience and the purpose, okay? That's going back to that context that we've been discussing of what's happening in England at the time and who are the people that are reading this, okay? That's going to help you understand it a little bit better. Also, some things that I want you to think about are how are the rhetorical appeals. How does he create his argument? How does he establish authority with his audience to get his purpose across, or his ethos, his authority? How does he establish that? Students will often think that in fictional texts you can't have authority because it's fake. Well, no, there are cues that people do to establish authority. Just the very fact that he is making a story about a monarch is going to be part of the authority, okay? There's also several other examples besides that. Pathos. How does he use emotion to convince the audience of his purpose? Logos. How does he use logic to convince his audience of his purpose? And I know in previous English courses you might have learned that logos is statistics and facts, and that is true, but remember, logos is also reasoned arguments. If I do this, then this will happen. And when you're talking about a moral tale, there is definitely a logical argument there. If you fall in love with this lady, then bad things happen. If you do this good deed for the king, then great things happen. So think about how those logical things work. Good purposes in fiction and nonfiction are developed rhetorically. When you're writing a paper or when you're developing an argument orally, maybe to a friend, maybe you want to convince somebody that you need a raise, you have to develop these skills of being able to appeal to your audience for your specific purpose. And that's why we're reading this. It's not so that you can become the foremost expert on Malory, though if you did, I would be incredibly flattered, and I would hope you would mention me in your acknowledgments of your book on Malory. But more than likely, that's not going to be the case of what you're going to study in the future. And if that isn't the case, what I want you to be able to do is to be able to pick out and understand how these things work in this text, because then you'll be able to apply those same skills to the text that you read and write in your everyday life. So, since there's not a lot of background on Malory, because we're so unsure, that's really all I have for you on background on Malory. Do listen to the podcast to fill in more blanks. I think that might help you a little bit more. And so this concludes our study of the Middle Ages.